This session will provide you with a clear understanding of what's required to succeed in exporting your food products to Canada, and we'll explore how Canada's regulatory environment functions and what Costa Rican businesses must do to prepare food products for entry into the Canadian market. So this will include things like understanding the role of regulatory agencies, legal requirements, food safety systems, mandatory labeling, and what types of certifications may open more doors for your business. So just to start off, my name is Drake Poirier. I work for Quality Smart Solutions here in Canada. So just a little bit about us to start this off. We are a global consulting firm engaged in providing strategic support for products, including many different things like food and beverages, natural health products, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, pet products, anything like that. In areas like regulatory support, facility licensing, clinical development, and more. And our company also offers importer of record services for foods and natural health products. And the food aspect is what we'll be discussing today. So these are just some of the service options that we offer around the world. Obviously, most of our services are focused in Canada and the US, but we also have services in Australia and Europe as well. And just a little bit about me before we dive into the presentation here. I'm the quality assurance lead for Quality Smart Solutions. I oversee our quality and compliance activities and operations, as well as all of our import processes. So people who are importing with us typically are working with me. I have over 5 years experience in this field, so I've been doing imports for quite a while, and I have a pretty in-depth knowledge of the import process for both foods and natural health products. My original background is in biochemistry from the University of British Columbia. So here's a brief overview of what we'll be covering today. So we'll begin by understanding the structure of food regulation in Canada and how food is classified. And from there, we'll walk through the key legislations, the role of the CFIA, which is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and your responsibilities as an exporter as well. Then we'll cover labeling, certifications, and documentation, and give you some practical guidance on entering the Canadian market. So by the end of today's session, you'll hopefully have a clear understanding of the roadmap and the checklists that you can apply immediately to assess your readiness to prevent shipping issues if you're exporting products into Canada. So Canada's food regulatory system. So in Canada, food regulation is a shared responsibility. There's 3 major agencies that are involved with this process. So the first one that I already mentioned is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is obviously specific to foods. They inspect, verify, and enforce regulations. Health Canada is kind of the overarching government body that develops health-related standards for many different product types, but including foods. So they also set limits for additives, nutrition labeling, and allergens, things like that. The CBSA, or the Canadian Border Services Agency, handles the logistical aspect. So they are the ones actually at the border. They ensure that goods clear customs properly. So understanding this tri-agency model and how we do things here in Canada will help you know where to focus your documentation and compliance efforts. So just as a practical example of how this works, if you were shipping a pallet of something like fortified food bars to Canada, Health Canada would be the one that determined the levels of fortification that are safe, so the amount of those ingredients that you can add to your product. CFIA would be the one that checks all your documents and labels, and then the CBSA would ensure all that documentation is in order at the point of entry and release the shipment into Canada. So these 3 agencies really all work together to regulate foods. If you're sending products into Canada, you'll be dealing with each of them at different times. So some key food legislation. These are the government acts that kind of oversee how food is regulated in Canada. So the first one is the Food and Drugs Act. That's kind of the overarching legislation. It governs the safety of many different types of products in Canada. So things like foods, natural health products, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, medical devices, anything like that is all covered under this legislation. So for food specifically, this act covers safety. It prohibits adulteration and false claims, and it regulates food composition and nutrient content. The Safe Food for Canadians Act and its associated regulations are kind of the foundation of modern food regulation in Canada. So these pieces of legislation introduce licensing for manufacturers and importers, mandatory preventative control plans, and traceability requirements. So this legislation took 14 older, more commodity-specific regulations, and it kind of put them all into one system. So everything's a little bit more simplified and streamlined in the modern system. And then the Consumer Packaging and Labeling Act, that one regulates how information appears on packaging. So it covers, again, many different types of products, but it also covers foods. So this one sets out the requirements for labeling consumer products, and it applies to the vast majority of consumer prepackaged goods sold at retail in Canada. So exporters must consider all three of these when selling to Canada, and meeting the requirements of each is a must. So there'll be certain things that have to be pulled from each of these regulations that apply to your product. And then if you happen to produce higher risk products, such as like meat, seafood, or organic food, there will be additional rules that also apply. So that can be things like the Canada Organic Regime for organic certifications, or commodity specific standards for those higher risk foods. And that is all something we'll cover later on in the presentation. Okay, so food categories in Canada. So in Canada, there are two major types of food products. So foods are basically either considered conventional foods or supplemented foods. There are some other types of foods, but they're quite becoming more and more rare as Canada pushes things into these two categories. So in practice, moving forward, these are really the only two that you likely need to worry about. So conventional foods are everyday foods. So things like bread, juice, pasta, canned vegetables, those would be standard, more common foods without any added health supporting components. So those types of foods are governed by the Safe Foods for Canadians regulations and the Food and Drug regulations, which we discussed on the previous slide. The other main category is supplemented foods. So supplemented foods include products that contain functional ingredients that have been added to the product. So that can be things like caffeine, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, or herbal extracts. So those may include protein-enriched snack bars, vitamin-fortified drinks, or energy beverages. So like a specific example of this would be something like a vitamin-fortified cookie. And so these types of foods are governed by a new piece of legislation that's actually just coming into effect, which is the Supplemented Foods Regulations. We didn't discuss that one on the previous slide. This is one of those other types, which is commodity specific. But this is a new set of regulations for the specific supplemented food category. So this classification is very important to know for your product. It affects which regulations apply to you, and it will affect things like labeling, claims you can make on the product, and your actual formula itself, like what can be in your product, is determined by which category it falls under. So as I mentioned, those supplemented food regulations are relatively new. They came into effect back in 2022. But there is currently an enforcement grace period on that, so it hasn't fully come into effect yet. However, all products are going to have to comply fully with this act by December 31st, 2025, so by the end of this year. So if your product could be considered supplemented, now is really the time to be preparing for that transition. We're less than 6 months away now, so if your food is supplemented, you'll definitely want to start considering these regulations and complying with them in the immediate future. So if you're unsure which category your product would fall under, whether it would be supplemented or conventional, the best practice is to have it reviewed by an expert. There is a list maintained by Health Canada, which is called the List of Permitted Supplemental Ingredients. So you can find that list online, and it lists which ingredients would be considered common in supplemented foods and their conditions of use. And then if you're still unsure, you can contact Health Canada to ask this, or again, you can hire a consultant who has expertise in this area. They'll definitely be able to have a look at your product and help you categorize it. Okay, so the CFIA's role. So again, this is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and they are the primary gatekeeper for imported food products in Canada. So their job is to ensure what enters the country is safe, properly labeled and compliant with Canadian law. So they will be the ones that review import documentation, such as labeling, origin certificates, safety certificates, any phytosanitary certificates, if you have those. They would be the ones that would be reviewing all those documents. At the border itself, the CFIA may physically inspect or sample products, especially if they belong to a high-risk category, or if you've had compliance issues in the past, or if the importers had compliance issues in the past, then you're just more likely to be targeted for those inspections. If they do choose to stop your shipment and test it, they can test it for microbial contaminants, chemical contaminants, and they may even verify ingredient authenticity. So they may test the product to verify that what's on the label is actually correct. And then they may also verify traceability and label compliance. So again, just having a look at your labels to make sure they meet all of the rules. So some key tools and platforms that the CFIA relies on. One of the big ones is the Automated Import Reference System, or AIRS. So this is used to confirm commodity-specific rules. And then there's also the MyCFIA portal for processing documents and licenses. So the CFIA uses a risk-based approach. So again, that's back to what I mentioned earlier, that if the importer or the brand has any kind of a poor history, or if you're shipping certain high-risk foods, you're more likely to be targeted for these random inspections. So we will discuss the AIRS and MyCFIA tools in much more detail in our second session today. Okay, so licensing under the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. So foreign exporters do not need a Safe Food for Canadians license. Those are specific for Canadian entities. So your Canadian import partner must hold one in order to legally bring your products into Canada. So this license ensures that the importer is the one who's accountable for food safety, traceability, and regulatory compliance of any products that are being imported under their license. However, as the exporter, your role in this is critical. You need to supply all the necessary documentation, such as things like ingredient lists, facility certifications, and shipping records. You should also support your importer proactively with their preventative control plan by providing test results and batch data. So the best way to think about this license is as a shared compliance tool. Your cooperation with your importer will strengthen their regulatory standing, and they will rely on the exporter to provide these documents in order to maintain their compliance. So preventative control plans, these are a major aspect of the Safe Foods for Canadians licenses. Health Canada and the CFIA require these for importers. So having them in place in advance is critical. So these are much more than just a regulatory checkbox. In essence, a preventive control plan is a formal written food safety plan required under the SFCR for most importers, manufacturers, and even exporters selling products to Canada. So there are some key components that will be found in the vast majority of preventative control plans. So these include things like hazard analysis and controls, identifying in advance any biological, physical, and chemical hazards, and implementing control measures to manage them. So this is really considering what could go wrong in advance, thinking about it, and putting plans in place to mitigate those risks as much as possible. Sanitation and hygiene programs, so procedures for cleaning facilities, equipment, etc. Anything that's involved in the process, you'll need to have a procedure on how that's kept clean and hygienic. Allergen control is another major aspect of PCPs. So that's things like preventing cross-contamination. If a facility has a known allergen in it, how do you ensure your product doesn't become contaminated? As well as ensuring accurate labeling if there are allergens in your product. And then traceability systems. So traceability is being able to show where your product came from and where it went. So we'll discuss those in much more detail in a moment. And then monitoring and corrective procedures. So this is another big part of a PCP is monitoring yourself, monitoring controls that are in place and ensuring they're functioning effectively. So that can be done with things like temperature logs, sanitation logs, things like that. And then also having corrective procedures for if a control does fail or if a deviation occurs. And then another big part of the PCP is record keeping. So documenting that entire process that I just talked about, having documents to back up everything that you're doing, including things like monitoring, verification, and corrective actions. So overall, this preventative control plan is a formal system that outlines how a business prevents food safety issues before they happen. It's really about determining potential issues before they arise, wherever possible. Now, sometimes issues will arise that were not foreseen or thought of in advance. Sometimes there's things that you just can't predict that come up during these processes. So that can be during manufacturing or shipping or anything like that. So another key aspect of these PCPs is having the systems in place to respond to those issues identified after the fact and being able to correct them to prevent them from occurring repeatedly. So Canadian importers have to have one of these. They'll have ones for your product if you're working with them. So they may ask you for documents to support it, especially from the manufacturing side and things like that. So even if these aren't legally required in your country, having your own food safety plan kind of shows buyers and regulators that you take safety very seriously. And it also makes it easier to respond to any questions from CFIA or CBSA and audits that may come about. So if you happen to be certified under an international body like GFSI or Codex HACCP, then you're likely well positioned to align with these expectations already. And it would be fairly straightforward from there to put those documents into a preventative control plan. Okay, so traceability standards. Traceability is essential for food safety and rapid recall responses. So that's really why CFIA puts so much emphasis on this, is being able to recall lots whenever needed. So in Canada, every food item must be traceable from the supplier to the next step in the supply chain. So this means your Canadian importer must know exactly where your product came from and where it went. So we call this the one step forward, one step back principle. This basically means you must be able to trace your product one step before it arrived to your facility or to you, and one step after it left. So one step before might be things like ingredient suppliers, or if you use a manufacturer and they shipped it to you, things like that. One step after it left could be to the distributor, warehouse, retailer, anything like that, depending on your specific supply chain scenario. So you'll need to keep detailed production and shipment records and apply clear batch codes to your packaging. So the more organized you keep your traceability system, the easier it is to meet those regulatory needs and earn importer confidence. So a couple of practical tips for this. Ensure your batch codes match on all of your documents and the physical product. So you can't have a different batch code on your documents and on your product. Well, I mean, you can, but it makes it more confusing. It'll cause issues. So keeping that consistent is the easiest way to do it. And ensure that batch code is traceable back to the manufacturer of the product. So a consumer should be able to look at the batch code on your label and trace it all the way back to the manufacturer if needed for a recall or something like that. And another thing here is to record the batch codes of all raw materials used. So if you're using raw inputs into your products to make the finished good, then you'll want to ensure that those raw material batch codes are traceable back to the supplier. QR codes are also a great way to improve efficiency and ensure traceability of your products. So some mandatory labeling elements here. So your label is the first thing that the CFIA will check, and it's often the reason that shipments get delayed or rejected. Labeling issues are by far the most common thing that we see that causes issues for exporters. So even minor formatting errors can trigger non-compliance. So things that you may not think are a big deal at all, the CFIA may not see it that way. So Canada has very detailed rules for labeling, including things like where to place the nutrition facts table and how to format allergen declarations, all of which you've got to make sure you're meeting in order to be compliant. So some required components for the label in Canada include things like the common name and net quantity of the product, the full ingredient list, including grouping sugars and highlighting allergens. So allergen statements, whether they're in your ingredient list or not, need to be there. And then a Canadian formatted nutrition facts table and a country of origin statement as well, if it's not made in Canada. The other major aspect to Canadian labels, which is different from most countries, is the requirement to include all information in English and French. So both official languages for Canada must be present on the label. In pretty much all circumstances, there are some minor exceptions to that. There can be times where you get a language exemption, but the vast majority of products will need both English and French. So some of these minor details can be the difference between compliance and non-compliance. Again, things like disclosing food colors, grouping things correctly, the ingredient list being in the right order, all those sorts of things can cause you problems if they are not correct. So the biggest thing for this is to review your labels early and work with your importer or a consultant to verify compliance in advance. So just an example of things that can happen. I've seen exporters have entire shipments held because they were using something like a US style nutrition facts table. They may have been missing French, even just for a small area of the label if you're missing French, or had wrong formatting for your nutrition facts table. So these types of things can cause a lot of charges as well, and storage fees while your entire lot is held, sometimes relabeled or stickered over, which may take a significant amount of time. So again, label compliance is extremely important, and just having the right people review your labels in advance will really help reduce the risk of stoppages. So priority allergens. We've mentioned allergen labeling a couple times, so we'll get into some specifics on it here. Canada has identified 11 priority allergens, and these have been identified based on their severity and frequency of allergic reactions in the general population. So these are things that are considered more likely that people would be allergic to. So the 11 of them are peanuts, tree nuts, milk, eggs, soy, wheat, sesame, fish, shellfish, mustard, and sulfites. So these must be clearly declared on food labels, either within the ingredient list or in a separate contains statement. And specifically for tree nuts and fish, Canadian regulations require that you name the specific type, such as almond or walnut, salmon or cod for fish, rather than using general terms. That just helps protect consumers with specific allergies, because obviously if you're allergic to one type of tree nut, you may not be allergic to all of them. So it's important that they know which ones are a concern in your product. So allergen names should be easy to find and formatted in bold or contrasting text when you list them within the ingredient list. So if you're putting these directly in your ingredient list, again, just that bold or contrasted text so that it's easy to pick out. If you don't put them in the ingredient list, you can put them as a separate statement preceded by the word contains. And then you will see labels with precautionary statements. So that's things like may contain. So those are voluntary and they are allowed in Canada if there is a real risk of cross-contamination. So, if your product is made in a facility that's also making a peanut product and you want to put may contain peanuts to be on the safe side, that's fine. But they do need to be based on documented risk assessments. So you'll need to have documentation to back up the fact that your product may actually contain those allergens. So some companies try to use precautionary statements like this as a blanket solution because they think it makes them a little bit safer to call it out just in case. But the CFIA may actually consider this to be misleading to consumers, and it may raise concerns on their end. So again, sometimes if you think you're being safe by putting may contain, it can actually cause you more trouble than it's worth, especially if you don't have documentation to back it up, because it may actually make your label fall into a non-compliant category and cause those stoppages that we've been talking about. So some other labeling considerations. These are other things that'll be required on your labels. Some good things to consider. Imported products with a Canadian address listed must show the address preceded by the term imported by or distributed by. So some examples of declaring company address and principal place of business are shown in the slide. So you'll see there the chocolate bar that's imported by Hershey, a beverage labeled with a US company address. So that company did not list the Canadian address, which is also fine. And then a mustard product, which is labeled product of France correctly, with country of origin listed there. And so if you make claims like health and nutrient content claims, so these are things like saying a product is high in fiber or a source of iron or things of this nature, there are very specific nutrient thresholds that they must meet in order to be able to make statements like that. So if you don't meet those minimum requirements, those statements would be considered non-compliant. So it's very important that you ensure your product falls in the correct threshold ranges in order to make statements like that. And so for organic products, you'll need proof of certification from an approved body. So there are very specific requirements for using the organic logo, which is shown in the slide there, the Organic Canada logo, and any organic statements in Canada. So we'll cover organic statements and compliance much more in session 2. And then even bulk shipments must have visible product details at the point of delivery. So the person receiving or inspecting the product must be able to read the label on the outer package. So even if you're sending your product in case packages or some sort of an outer box, it needs to be labeled so that the receiver can understand all of the label information when they receive it. And then another good thing to think about is that many exporters will use templates from other countries for their labels that don't necessarily meet Canadian rules. So having a label that's compliant somewhere else does not mean that it will be compliant in Canada. Our labeling requirements here are very specific. So again, it's best to have a consultant or your importer review your labels for compliance in advance of your shipments. The best practice is to keep your labels clean, compliant, and backed by documentation. And again, I highly recommend having your importer or a consultant review those for you in advance. So front of package labeling, this is one of Canada's newest food regulations that's coming into effect. And so it's something that all food exporters need to be aware of. So if your food contains excessive amounts of sodium, sugar, or saturated fat, and it exceeds the defined thresholds that Health Canada has set, then a warning symbol must be added to the front of the package. So these symbols are standardized and they must meet all the formatting rules. You'll see an example of one shown on the slide here. So this example is high in all three categories, the saturated fat, sugars, and sodium. You will also have templates that are only high in one or multiple of these. So this is the template that will be going on the front of packages for products above the thresholds moving forward. So there are some exemptions for this as well. For some categories like whole fruits or dairy, they don't necessarily have to have these, even if they are above the thresholds. But the vast majority of ready-to-eat meals and packaged foods will need to comply with this new regulation. So it's a good idea to run your product formulas through nutritional analysis now in advance of this coming into effect. So the official enforcement for this begins on January 1st, 2026. So similar to those supplemented food regulations we talked about earlier, kind of end of this year, beginning of next, this is coming into effect. So the time to prepare for this is now. So all products requiring these front of package labels will need to have them on their labels by January 1st. So some certifications to consider that are recognized in Canada. So certification is a strong business tool, and it's definitely something we recommend, but it is not mandated by Canadian law. So you do not have to have these. Having said that, though, most retailers and food service buyers in Canada will want to see that you follow a recognized food safety standard. This is pretty common practice and certainly becoming more common with purchasers and retailers here in Canada. So it's a good thing to consider if you're planning to export your products here. So GFSI is considered the gold standard. So having certification to things like BRCGS, SQF, or FSSC 22000, those help build trust. So those are the BRC Global Standard for Food Safety, Safe Quality Food Initiative, and the Food Safety Certification. There's also things like the Canada Organic Regime, so certified organic, and HACCP or GMP standards as well. So again, touching on those organic claims, those have to be backed by an approved certification program that meets Canada's standards in order for you to make those claims. And certification is essentially a tool that helps you stand out from your competitors. It can help you streamline onboarding with importers and with CFIA. And it gives your Canadian partners assurance they can rely on you. So we'll cover some certifications in a lot more depth in session 2. So some common pitfalls that we see regularly with exporters who are trying to get products into Canada. There are many issues that can delay or block shipments that are completely avoidable. So if you know about them in advance, it can really help you to not fall into these. So again, I mentioned it earlier, but the most common problem is definitely labeling. So it can be very minor things like font size, missing French, or incorrect formatting of the nutrition facts table. Anything like that can definitely cause issues for your imports. Documentation, so incomplete documentation. Sometimes exporters fail to provide full documents, like a certificate of analysis or allergen statement, or if a document is missing that wasn't provided that is required. Those types of things are common issues that we see a lot. Marketing claims not supported by data. So there's a lot of products out there that'll make claims like natural or immune boosting or things like that without any data to back them. So some of those things can be said on foods, but you do need to have validated scientific support to make claims of that nature. And then traceability problems. So this is another really common one. Things like repeated batch codes or missing batch records. These can really damage your importer's trust and your reputation. So again, this can be minor things like the batch code on the case product not matching the batch code shown on documentation or even an invoice. Those sorts of things will be noticed by the CFIA and they can cause significant delays and stoppages. So having your own internal checklists and asking your importer to help you review your documents in advance will save you trouble and hopefully help you avoid falling into these common pitfalls. So I just mentioned having your own internal checklist. This is an example of one that you could use for your exports before you ship your products. So if you walk through something like this in advance, it'll help you make sure everything's in order and avoid issues. So the first thing, you can use that errors tool that I mentioned earlier, the automated import reference system, to check the rules that apply to your food. So we'll show you more in session 2 of how to use that tool, but basically it'll provide you with the information specific to your product to show you the requirements before you import so that you're not missing documents or things like that. Then review all of your labels, all of your documents, and every test result. So your documentation is key, and ensuring everything is in order and consistent prior to shipment will definitely help you reduce issues with your exports. Make sure your traceability records are clear and easy to follow and match with your batch codes. So a good practice is to test these yourself. Go through all your documents and make sure your batch codes match. Make sure you can trace your product one step forward and one step back. Then another big aspect of this is choosing an importer who's experienced and ready to work collaboratively with you on your exports. So importers should be experienced and very knowledgeable in all of the things that I've covered with you in this presentation. So they should also be able to help you go through these checklists and make sure all your documents in order prior to shipment. Another thing you can consider is a customs broker. So they can also help you by reviewing your paperwork before shipping. So certain customs brokers, especially ones that handle food shipments regularly, will understand all these requirements and they'll know what they're doing as well. So they can help you along with your importer to get things cleared through customs a little bit easier. So these steps help you build consistency and reduce delays at the border. So again, using a checklist like this is a good preventative measure before each shipment, and it'll help you avoid those costly holds and returns. Okay, so that is the end of our first session. So thank you for joining me today. Just a quick summary of everything that we kind of covered there. We talked about how Canada's food regulatory system works and who those key agencies are. We talked about the importance of understanding whether your product is a conventional or supplemented food and how to categorize it. critical laws like the Safe Food for Canadians regulations and Food and Drugs Act that are good things for you to know that will govern your shipments. We talked about the role of the CFIA in enforcing compliance and what to expect at the border. The need for licensing, your importer to have licensing, preventative control plans, and traceability systems. Talked about your label requirements and how to ensure your labels meet Canada's bilingual and technical requirements, including that new front of package labeling. And then finally, those common pitfalls that exporters face, with hopefully some practical tips on how to avoid those delays. So I encourage you to use those checklists and tools that we discussed today to assess your readiness, and don't hesitate to seek expert help to streamline your compliance process. So I'll now open this up if anyone has any questions for me regarding the content that we covered today.
Hi, Drake. Good morning. Thank you. I have a question about the preventive control plans that you mentioned. That one is the Canadian importer have to do it, but can we get it from the manufacturing? If they're in Spanish, we translate it to English and that will work, or we have to do something different?
No, ideally, yeah, if your manufacturer has one in place, that's great. So again, if they're following some of those international standards, they may already have it. Not every country uses them, so it just depends on whether your manufacturer will have it or not. But if they already have one in place, that'll definitely help your importer.
So yes, so if they have it, we can use that one, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, if they have it in place, you can check with your manufacturer. If they do, that'll definitely help you with your importer. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then I see that Rebecca put a question in the chat. Her question was, is there an entity or agency, either governmental or private, that certifies that a product is meeting packaging and labeling requirements? This is for the exporter to make sure they'll not face any problems during the import process. That's a great question. The answer is not really. There's no one that certifies those labels. But so consultants will review them and tell you whether or not they're compliant. So for example, at Quality Smart Solutions, we do review labels regularly, and then we'll tell you, okay, this is compliant, you're good to go. And then CFIA will clear those. But as far as like an actual certificate from, a government agency or a private company, that's not something that's generally used in practice, and definitely not available from a government agency.
I have another question. In the United States, if we want to import, as an importer, we need like a course that we need to take. Is that something that we need to do in Canada or not?
No, that's a great question as well. So there's no course for you as the exporter to take. Your importer is the one that Canada forces the licenses on. So your importer will have those licenses that they've dealt with kind of in the background. So for you as the exporter, there's no course that you would have to take.
Thank you.
No problem.
Hi, my question will be a little bit different because I'm asking as an importer and not an exporter to Canada. So I was wondering, I was told that normally we need to have some SOPs ready in hand in case that the authorities ask for us that what's your procedure to recall your product or cleaning, sanitation, I don't know, these things. I cannot find any format to prepare those SOPs. So I just was wondering if you can provide us with a very basic and initial format to have those SOPs to cover all these criterias for the importer.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, we didn't cover a lot of SOP information on this. We're a little more exporter focused than importer. So yeah, good point. You do have to have SOPs for things like recall, sanitation, and things like that. As far as templates go, there's not like a standard template that you're required to use. You can find templates online that are based on, I think the European Pharmacopoeia even publishes a standardized SOP template that you could use. But there's not necessarily, the CFIA will be much more focused on your content than they will on your format, if that makes sense. So, but main things to think about are things like, safety considerations, your actual procedure record keeping. They'll want to see an approval of some kind on the SOP. So a signature from a senior person at your company that's approved it. They'll want to see like version numbers, revision histories, if you're making changes to your SOPs. And another thing to think about is that there are companies out there that will help you with that, will write SOPs for you. That is something that we do as well at QSS. So if it's something you ever needed, you can hire people to help you kind of write those to ensure that they'll be compliant for the CFIA.
Thank you so much. And I'll go with the second question. I apologize in case you have already addressed that question, but I didn't understand enough for the labels. When it comes for the labels like non-GMO products, for example, I've seen that on many herbal tea, for example, packages that they use this non-GMO. I was wondering that if I have the statements crystal clear from the suppliers that this product doesn't have any GMO product, can I use those labels on my final product based on those statements, or I have to apply for those certificates to, you said that it is reviewed by some third parties like QSS, but I wanted to know how it works exactly. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great question. GMO is not something that I covered in the presentation, so that's a great thing to bring up. So GMO is a little bit different. It's basically a statement that you can make on your labels as long as you have that documentation to back it up. So I mentioned a few times that they really harp on having the documents to back up what you're saying on your product. So exactly what you mentioned there, if you have statements from your suppliers that are, basically signed attestations that your product doesn't contain any genetically modified foods, then you can make that statement on your labels.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for the questions.